is a mostly harmless memoir of our travels through the hazy realms of September 2024, featuring myself, Jessie, Ursula, Tyler, and a cast of characters so bizarre they could only have been dreamt up by a drunken Salvador Dali while listening to a particularly enthusiastic Nickelback cover band. Some of the details might be as accurate as a taxidermist memory, but remember, reality is frequently inaccurate. The Thursday dawned with all the rosy-fingered subtlety of a wrecking ball. It was on this day, dear reader, that Ursula and I, having successfully navigated the perilous labyrinth of packing, a feat worthy of Hercules himself, I assure you, deposited our offspring, Gary and Frank, at the grandparent holding facility. Their grandparents, bless their cotton socks, had volunteered for this noble duty, no doubt lured by the promise of unlimited Werther's originals and the opportunity to inflict embarrassing childhood stories upon unsuspecting visitors. Our escape route involved a metal bird hurtling through the atmosphere towards the bewildering hub of Charlotte, North Carolina. A brief layover ensued, a chaotic interlude of overpriced coffee and frantic searches for power outlets, before we were once again strapped into a pressurized tube and flung across the Atlantic towards Madrid. Now, I won't bore you with the details of in-flight entertainment. Suffice it to say that even the most sophisticated cinematic offerings can become tedious when viewed through the bottom of a recycled gin bottle, but I will mention the legroom. Ah, the legroom. A luxury typically reserved for those with platinum frequent flyer cards and an unhealthy obsession with miniature pretzels. But on this occasion, attainable by mere mortals like ourselves, with the sacrifice of a few measly dollars. A small price to pay, I assure you, for the ability to avoid deep vein thrombosis and the existential dread that inevitably accompanies a cramped transatlantic flight. Madrid materialized from the morning mist like a particularly surreal Salvador Dali painting. Having been awake since the dawn of time, or at least since the ungodly hour of 5 a.m. the day before, we stumbled through customs, where the officials, in a display of bureaucratic efficiency that would make a root canal patient weep with joy, simply stamped our passports and waved us through. No questions, no probing inquiries about the suspicious bulge in my pants. A souvenir snow globe, I assure you, and nothing more. Just a blissful indifference that bordered on the existential. Ursula, in a stroke of genius that confirmed her status as a supreme being amongst mere mortals, had contacted our accommodation in advance. This meant that, by the ludicrously early hour of 8 a.m., we were ensconced in our room, freshening up for a day of intrepid exploration. And explore we did, my friends, with the kind of manic energy that can only come from a combination of sleep deprivation and an overabundance of lukewarm airport coffee. We traversed the city with the determination of a herd of wildebeest on a caffeine-fueled migration, clocking up an impressive 20 miles, give or take a few, and taking in such sights as the Plaza Mayor, a bustling square that seemed to be perpetually hosting a pigeon convention, the Parque del Retiro, a vast expanse of green that made Central Park look like a postage stamp, and a monument to Alfonso the Toisson, a chap who, according to the inscription, was rather fond of horses. But the highlight of the day, the moment that will forever be etched in the annals of our travel memoirs, was the discovery of a banana. Not just any banana, mind you, but a wild, unattended banana basking in the Spanish sunshine like a golden beacon of potassium-rich goodness. It was a moment of such profound significance that I almost wept. Almost. Our evening culminated in a visit to a small cocktail bar called Fumbalista, a dimly lit establishment that seemed to specialize in serving drinks in glasses that defied the laws of physics and coasters that could double as abstract art. It was the kind of place where you could imagine yourself bumping into Hunter S. Thompson, or perhaps even a Florida alligator, though hopefully not the latter. All in all, a rather splendid start to our Iberian adventure. The day following our arrival was Ursula's birthday, a fact that Ursula herself seemed determined to celebrate with an almost religious fervor. This involved dragging me through the hallowed halls of the Prado, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with the concentrated essence of artistic genius. We gawked at Botticelli's ethereal beings, marveled at the sheer scale of Rubens's fleshy figures, and scratched our heads at Bosch's fevered dreamscapes. And then there were the paintings featuring that woman. You know the ones. The ones where she appears to be lactating across the vast expanse of the cosmos, aiming for some chap's open mouth with an accuracy that defied the laws of physics and good taste. Remarkable, I muttered, trying to subtly edge away from the canvas before anyone mistook me for an art critic. Lunch was an exercise in restrained tapas consumption. Apparently, the Spanish believe in a menú del día, a culinary odyssey that could sink a small ship. We, however, opted for a lighter approach, much to the apparent disappointment of our waiter, whose mustache seemed to droop with every tiny plate we ordered. The arrival of Tyler at Chamartin's station was heralded by much hugging and excited squealing, the sort that only three friends reunited after a period of separation can generate. We bundled her into a taxi and headed back to our hotel, a place that seemed to specialize in providing oddly shaped pillows and deliciously hot water. Evening was a blur of blue cheese-infused cocktails, don't ask, a jazz bar that seemed to exist in a time warp, and a birthday dinner in a bistro so small that we practically had to share our chorizo risotto with the chef. The salted caramel cheesecake was a triumph, though. I'd like to think even Picasso would have approved. And sadly, the elusive wild banana remained just that elusive. The next day, we wrestled our luggage, including an unexpectedly oversized carry-on, to the airport, joined the queue for our flight, a queue that appeared to stretch to the very edge of the known universe, and eventually found ourselves airborne. The flight itself was brief, punctuated only by the sight of a forest fire that looked worryingly like someone had taken a flamethrower to a particularly stubborn jigsaw puzzle. The Porto airport, like all airports, was a confusing labyrinth of signs, announcements in indecipherable languages, and people rushing about with the panicked air of those who'd misplaced their towels. Eventually, we located our Uber driver, Fernando, a man whose driving style could best be described as creative. He deposited us, with a flourish, at a pharmacy. Not our actual destination, of course, but apparently a landmark of some significance. Our apartment, it turned out, was down a cobbled alleyway that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight since the Middle Ages. After brunch at a hipster cafe, with a name that sounded vaguely threatening, Swallow Decadent Brunch. Did they mean that literally? We explored the ancient city of Porto. The place was a charming jumble of crooked buildings, steep hills, and breathtaking views of the Douro River. We even managed to find a pub with a decent pint, which is always a plus in my book. Our walking tour was led by an Irishman named let's just call him Quee. Quee, with his fiery red hair, bloodshot eyes, and a wardrobe that suggested a close encounter with a laundry-averse badger, was a veritable encyclopedia of historical knowledge. He regaled us with tales of invasions, revolutions, and architectural wonders, all delivered with a healthy dose of Irish wit and a distinct aroma of stale Guinness. Dinner was a revelation. A tiny taberna, overflowing with locals, plied us with deliciousness. Sliced meats, dates wrapped in ham, a culinary masterpiece, I tell you. Chorizo, cheese, and bread pizzas, topped with everything from smoked mackerel to pears. And the flan, oh, the flan. Made with passion fruit and a white wine reduction, it was the kind of dessert that makes you question the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But alas, still no wild banana. The universe, it seemed, was determined to keep its potassium-rich secrets to itself. Ah, Monday, the next day. That most peculiar of days when the universe seems to take a collective deep breath and say, "Right, let's get this party started." It was on such a Monday, dear reader, that we embarked on a pilgrimage to the hallowed land of the Douro Valley, a place where the grapes grow plump and juicy, and the wine flows like the tears of a particularly emotional teenager listening to the latest Taking Back Sunday album. Our chariot for this vinous adventure was a rather unremarkable van, piloted by a gentleman named Pedro, who, despite his reassuringly calm demeanor, possessed the driving skills of a caffeinated ferret on a unicycle. Accompanying us on this journey were two other couples, one from the exotic land of Atlanta, where, I am told, the locals communicate primarily through interpretive dance and the consumption of peach cobbler, and the other from the equally mysterious Fort Lauderdale, a place, I gather, where the primary forms of entertainment are shuffleboard and the contemplation of one's mortality. Now, I'm not one to judge a book by its cover, unless, of course, that cover happens to be adorned with a picture of a mime trapped in an invisible box. But I must confess that I harbored some reservations about our fellow travelers. They were, shall we say, of a certain vintage, and I couldn't help but worry that they might be the sort to engage in unsolicited discussions about the merits of various brands of denture adhesive or the intricacies of early bird specials. Thankfully, my fears proved unfounded, and they turned out to be quite delightful company, although their fascination with the migratory patterns of Canadian geese did become somewhat tiresome after the third hour. The Portuguese countryside, I must say, is a sight to behold. Rolling hills carpeted in vineyards, quaint villages perched precariously on cliff tops, and an overall sense of tranquility that could soothe even the most agitated 56-year-old cougar who has just happened to have used her last Xanax pill and is trying to hide the credit card statement from her husband. It reminded me, in a rather roundabout way, of the time I accidentally stumbled into a Costco where everyone spoke in limericks, and the currency was based on the number of freckles you had. It was a strange and beautifully mysterious place. Our journey took us through the historic town of Sabrosa, birthplace of the legendary explorer Ferdinand Magellan, a man who, I am reliably informed, had a rather unfortunate encounter with a coconut. We gazed upon the ruins of his childhood home, a crumbling edifice that spoke volumes about the transient nature of fame and the inevitability of entropy. And then, dear reader, we ventured into the heart of the Douro Valley, a land of winding roads and breathtaking vistas. Pedro, our intrepid driver, navigated the serpentine routes with the nonchalance of a seasoned rally driver, while I, clutching the dashboard with the desperation of a beaver clinging to a log in a particularly turbulent river, silently prayed to the gods of motion sickness. We paused at a scenic overlook, where we were treated to a panoramic view of the valley and a close encounter with a cork tree. These magnificent specimens, Pedro informed us, take a staggering 30 years to mature, a fact that made me feel rather inadequate about my own lack of productivity. I mean, what have I achieved in 30 years? Took a few showers, misplaced my wallet on countless occasions, and mastered the art of procrastination. Oh, and I once won a goldfish at a fairground, but it tragically met its demise after I gave it a whirlpool bath in what turned out to be a toilet. But I digress. As we continued our journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't just Pedro's driving, which was becoming increasingly erratic. I swear I saw him take a corner on two wheels at one point. But there was a strange tension in the air, a sense of impending doom that hung over us like a bad karaoke night. And then it hit me. The man from Atlanta. he was coughing. Coughing with the kind of hacking, phlegm-filled gusto that suggested he might be harboring a particularly nasty strain of the common cold. Or worse, could it be the dreaded cooties? We arrived at our first winery, a venerable establishment that claimed to be the oldest port producer in Portugal. Now, I'm not normally one for fortified wines. I find they tend to clash with my personality. But I must confess that the port was rather delicious. It was the kind of drink that made you want to sit back, contemplate the meaning of life, and perhaps write a strongly worded letter to the customer service department of whoever invented those self-assembly bookshelves, complaining about their shoddy workmanship. We learned about the intricate process of port production, which, it turns out, involves adding brandy to the wine to stop the fermentation process. A rather ingenious solution, I thought, although I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if you added brandy to other things. Orange juice, for example. Or perhaps a bowl of goldfish. The possibilities, as they say, are endless. Our next stop was the charming village of Pinhao, where we embarked on a leisurely boat trip down the Douro River. The scenery was stunning, the weather was glorious, and the Vinho Verde flowed freely. It was all very idyllic, until Pedro, in a fit of navigational enthusiasm, decided to take a shortcut through a particularly narrow channel. Let's just say that it involved a lot of shouting, a near miss with a rather startled duck, and a renewed appreciation for the structural integrity of Portuguese boat building. Thank the spaghetti monster, we returned to land unscathed. As the day wore on, Pedro's vehicular driving became increasingly reckless. He hurtled along the narrow roads with the abandon of a man possessed, overtaking on blind corners, ignoring traffic signals, and occasionally breaking into spontaneous renditions of Portuguese folk songs. I began to suspect that he had been secretly dosing us with some kind of illicit hooch, perhaps extracted from the adrenal glands of those aforementioned Canadian geese. We stopped for lunch at a picturesque restaurant overlooking the river. The food was delicious: sea bream, white and red wine, and a dessert that can only be described as a drunken prince. But I couldn't fully appreciate it, as I was too busy bracing myself for the inevitable moment when Pedro would decide to drive us off a cliff. By the time we reached our final winery, I was convinced that we were all going to die. Pedro was now driving with the kind of manic energy that suggested he had been inhabited by the spirit of a Formula One driver. We narrowly avoided several head-on collisions, and at one point, I'm pretty sure we took flight for a brief moment. It was, to put it mildly, hilariously terrifying. Somehow, miraculously, we survived. We stumbled out of the van, shaken but alive, and collapsed onto the nearest patch of grass. As I lay there, gazing up at the clouds, I couldn't help but think that perhaps, just perhaps, we had been spared by the gods of travel, who, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that we weren't quite ready to join the choir invisible. Or maybe, just maybe, Pedro had finally achieved his time schedule. The next morning arrived shrouded in a smoky haze, a grim reminder that even in this picturesque corner of the universe, things could go terribly, terribly wrong. The air reeked of burnt toast and week-old socks, and the wind howled like a banshee with a particularly nasty head cold. "Charming," I remarked, peering out the window at the apocalyptic orange sky. Just charming. Despite the impending sense of doom, we managed to pack our bags, an activity that always seems to involve more stuffing and swearing than strictly necessary, grab a coffee and a pastry that tasted suspiciously like a hockey puck rolled in sugar, and head to the bus station. Now, bus stations, in my experience, are rarely havens of tranquility, but this one seemed particularly keen on providing us with entertainment. A passenger, apparently convinced that he was on the right bus, or perhaps in the wrong dimension, engaged in a heated debate with the driver, a debate that involved much gesticulating, shouting, and threats to involve the local constabulary. The whole scene was rather reminiscent of a French farce, only with less cheese and more existential angst. Eventually, we boarded the bus, a vehicle that appeared to have been designed by a committee of sadists. Our seats, naturally, were scattered throughout the rear, ensuring maximum discomfort and minimal conversation. Still, at least none of our fellow passengers seemed to be suffering from any contagious diseases, which I considered a small victory. As we trundled south, the smoke thickened, turning the landscape into a scene from a particularly bleak lyric. "The car is on fire, and there's no driver at the wheel," I muttered to myself, quoting a rather apt song by a band called Godspeed, You Black Emperor. The whole experience was a stark reminder of the fragility of existence, the precariousness of our little lives in the face of the universe's capricious whims. And then, to add insult to injury, we received an email informing us that our tour to Sintra had been canceled due to the wildfires. Sintra, the place of fairy tale castles, mystical forests, and, dare I hope, wild bananas. The disappointment was palpable, especially for Tyler, who had been looking forward to it with the enthusiasm of a puppy presented with a squeaky toy. The rest of the journey was a blur of motorway, fire-ravaged hillsides, and uncomfortable silences. We stopped in Coimbra, Fatima, and lastly, Lisbon, each stop a chaotic exercise in sardine-like packing and unpacking. At one point, I swear I saw flames licking the edge of the road, but perhaps it was just a hallucination brought on by smoke inhalation and an acute lack of bananas. Lisbon, when we finally arrived, was a welcome relief. Our apartment, nestled in the labyrinthine Alfama district, was a charming little place with a washing machine, a feature that Tyler greeted with the sort of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. After depositing our luggage, an activity that involved navigating a footpath so steep it practically required climbing gear, we ventured out to explore. The Alfama, with its narrow streets, ancient buildings, and distinct lack of tourists, felt like a hidden world, a place untouched by the relentless march of globalization. We wandered aimlessly, marveling at the crumbling facades, the wrought-iron balconies, and the occasional glimpse of the Tagus River shimmering in the distance. We even made friends with a local dog, a scruffy creature, with a surprisingly good sense of personal space. Dinner was an adventure in itself. We found a tiny restaurant, 2EEU, that specialized in grilled sardines, a local delicacy that I, in my infinite wisdom, proceeded to eat entirely wrong. Note to self, bones are not a condiment. Despite my culinary faux pas, the food was delicious, the atmosphere lively, and the company, as always, delightful. As the evening drew to a close, we sipped cocktails from hollowed-out pineapples. We were suckers to the few tourist trappings that did exist, gazed at the twinkling lights of the city, and reflected on the day's adventures. And despite the smoke, the fires, and the canceled tour, we had somehow managed to find joy, laughter, and even a washing machine, not in the wild, I assure you. And while the wild banana remained stubbornly elusive, I couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism. After all, as Douglas Adams once wrote, the universe is a strange and wonderful place, and even in the midst of chaos, there's always the possibility of finding something truly extraordinary. The dawn of the 18th of September arrived with the insistent cheerfulness of a hyperactive robot toddler wielding a cymbal. I awoke to find myself bathed in the unforgiving glare of Lisbon's sunshine, which was streaming through the skylight with the intensity of 1,000 suns, or at least a particularly powerful halogen bulb. After wrestling with the laundry, a task that proved surprisingly challenging for a man who once outsmarted a particularly stubborn IKEA instruction manual, and engaging in a protracted battle with the espresso machine, a contraption that seemed determined to scald me with boiling water and cover me in coffee grounds. I finally emerged from the apartment, blinking like a mole in a spotlight. We stumbled upon a super cute brunch cafe, a term that, in my experience, is often used to describe establishments with an alarmingly high concentration of artisanal toast and reclaimed wood furniture. Nevertheless, the coffee was strong, the pastries were flaky, and the atmosphere was pleasantly devoid of pretentiousness. Suitably fortified, we set off to explore the ancient fortifications of St. George's Castle, a place where history hung in the air as thick as the fog on a particularly damp day in the swamps of Louisianan bayous. We gazed out at the majestic views of the city, imagining ourselves as intrepid explorers surveying a newly discovered continent, although admittedly one with a rather high density of souvenir shops and gelato stands. Our wanderings then took us to Pink Street, a vibrant thoroughfare that seemed to pulsate with the energy of 1,000 hyperactive hummingbirds. We marveled at the eclectic mix of shops, cafes, and street performers, and finally happened upon the elusive wild banana, this time partially eaten. Its besmirched appearance, a sight that, I must confess, filled me with a strange mixture of excitement and existential dread. After a brief respite, a necessity, I assure you, after a morning of such intense cultural immersion, we ventured out once more, this time to experience the melancholic beauty of fado music. The performance was both haunting and mesmerizing, and the cocktails at the upscale bar were so potent that I briefly considered challenging the bartender to a duel with cocktail umbrellas. Dinner was served on a terrace, complete with cozy blankets to ward off the evening chill, and the highlight of the meal was undoubtedly the banana ceviche, a culinary masterpiece that I vowed to recreate at the bed and breakfast. Assuming, of course, we owned a bed and breakfast and that I could find a banana that wasn't already partially eaten. The following day, we embarked on a quest for knowledge at the Water Museum, a fascinating repository of all things aquatic. We marveled at the steam pumps, pondered the history of water in Lisbon, a tale that involved more intrigue and political maneuvering than one might expect, and stumbled upon a public fountain that appeared to dispense water based on one's skin color and gender, a concept that struck me as both bizarre and sad. We also had a rather unfortunate encounter with another public square fountain, which resulted in us getting drenched, maybe my mind sometimes tricks me, and attracting the attention of several bemused pigeons. Our culinary adventures continued with a food tour led by a gentleman named Andre, a young chap who had worked at the Portuguese embassy in the UK and currently dabbled in the art of magic, although his attempts to pull a rabbit out of a hat were somewhat less than impressive. Our fellow tour participants were a retired couple from Wisconsin who seemed to be perpetually amazed by everything they saw, including, to my amusement, a rather ordinary-looking lamppost. The food, I must say, was a revelation. We sampled a bewildering array of delicacies, from the ubiquitous pastel de nata, a custard tart that could make a grown man weep with joy, to the more adventurous codfish and beef liver, a dish that, I suspect, was invented by a particularly mischievous culinary sadist. We also partook of Roman-style fish oil, a surprisingly palatable concoction, fireman's chorizo, a sausage with a fiery kick that could rival a Nickelback concert, and a variety of croquettes that were so delicious I almost considered proposing marriage to the chef. Our gastronomic journey took us to a former Chinese restaurant that had been transformed into a traditional taverna, a Roman Colosseum that was slowly being unearthed. Apparently the plan was to eventually stage gladiatorial combat with inflatable swords and oversized helmets, and a world-class fado school where aspiring singers could learn to channel their inner melancholy. We even had a close encounter with a cherry-soaked liquor called ginja, which I, in a moment of reckless abandon, decided to down in one gulp, much to the amusement of the proprietor, Susanna. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the city, we found ourselves at the Miradouro da Graca, gazing out at a breathtaking panorama of mountains, clouds, and a statue of Jesus that seemed to be keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings. We sipped our last superbock and sangria, savoring the moment and reflecting on the adventures that had brought us to this point. It had been a journey filled with laughter, near-death experiences, and a surprising number of bananas. And as we drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Perhaps a close encounter with a particularly pushy Portuguese souvenir salesman. Or maybe, just maybe, another wild banana. And so, dear reader, we bid a fond farewell to Lisbon, the city of 7 hills, melancholic music, and surprisingly delicious banana ceviche. Our departure was as chaotic as our arrival, with a pre-dawn dash to the airport, a near miss with a runaway baggage trolley, and a boarding process that could only be described as a sardine-themed mosh pit. Our next destination, Lyon, the gastronomic capital of France, or so they purport. A place where the butter flows like wine and the cheese shops are guarded by fierce-looking men wielding baguettes. But first, we had to endure the purgatory of air travel, a soul-crushing experience that makes a root canal seem like a delightful afternoon tea party. Thankfully, the flight was relatively short, and the pilot, a maverick, who clearly believed the laws of physics were mere suggestions and seemed to have watched one too many Fast and Furious movies, managed to defy gravity and somehow land the plane in one piece. Although I did notice a few nervous glances exchanged between the passengers as we bounced along the runway. Lyon greeted us with open arms and a rather impressive selection of charcuterie. We checked into our hotel, a swanky establishment that reeked of money and good taste, or at least the kind of good taste that can be acquired with a sufficiently large bank balance. After depositing our luggage, which by this point seemed to have gained sentience and was actively plotting to escape, we ventured out to explore the city. First stop, Maison du Culte, a temple of gastronomic delights where the language of cheese transcends mere human speech. The kindly purveyors of fine comestibles, bless their souls, patiently deciphered our attempts at French and presented us with a veritable feast of meaty and cheesy goodness. And then there was the fish dough, a culinary enigma wrapped in a carbohydrate conundrum. We ate it, of course, eager to sample the imaginative delicacy and to please our host. When in Rome, Lyon, or any other corner of the universe, do as the locals do, I always say. Fueled by fish dough and an insatiable thirst for culture, we set off to explore the architectural wonders of Lyon. The Basilica Notre Dame, perched atop Fourvière Hill, offered breathtaking views of the city, a sprawling tapestry of rooftops, church spires, and distant mountains. We even stumbled upon another Roman amphitheater, a relic of a bygone era when entertainment involved gladiators, lions, and a distinct lack of health and safety regulations. Feeling a tad peckish and perhaps a little overwhelmed by the sheer weight of history by finding the Camino de Santiago, we sought refuge in a British pub called the Nook. Now, finding a British pub in France is a bit like discovering a penguin in the Sahara Desert, unexpected, to say the least. But this one was a gem, complete with warm beer, sticky floors, and a soundtrack of 90s alternative rock that transported us back to our misspent youth. It was like stepping into a time machine and ending up in a particularly rowdy episode of MTV's The Real World. After a few restorative cocktails at the hotel bar, where the bartender seemed to specialize in concoctions that tasted suspiciously like rocket fuel, we embarked on a culinary adventure of truly epic proportions. Le Casse-Museau, or the Snoutbreaker, was a bastion of traditional Lyonnaise cuisine, a place where the food was as authentic as a beret-wearing mime. Our host, a jovial chap with a handlebar mustache and a limited grasp of English, insisted we order in French, a challenge we met with a mixture of enthusiasm and blind panic. The meal was a symphony of flavors, a culinary ballet performed on our taste buds. We started with la gratin lyonnaise, which turned out to be fried pork skin, a snack that was both crispy and surprisingly addictive. Then came the main courses. Herring and pike for me. I clearly had a penchant for the piscine. Lyonnaise salad and steak for Ursula, a woman of discerning taste, and lentils and chicken for Tyler, who, bless her soul, was still recovering from the fish dough incident. All this was accompanied by the boisterous cheers of a large group of young men celebrating something or other. We never did figure out what the occasion was, but their enthusiasm was infectious, adding a certain je ne sais quoi to the already vibrant atmosphere. The walk back to the hotel was punctuated by a surreal encounter with a train of rollerbladers, 100-strong procession of flashing lights and rhythmic whooshing. It was like witnessing a disco on wheels, a spectacle that left us all bewildered and strangely exhilarated. Back at the hotel, we toasted our Lyonnaise adventure with champagne and cocktails, the perfect end to a day filled with unexpected delights, culinary discoveries, and the lingering taste of French self-importance. And while the wild banana remained elusive, we knew deep down that our quest would continue. After all, the universe, in its infinite wisdom, had a way of surprising us, often in the most unexpected and delightful ways. The next day, before we endeavored to find the train station, we stumbled upon a farmer's market, a veritable cornucopia of fresh produce that made my mouth water like a hipster poet at a rhyming dictionary convention. We wandered through the stalls, marveling at the vibrant colors and exotic aromas, and eventually succumbed to the siren call of a coffee stall, where we were served a beverage that could have reanimated a dead dormouse. Suitably caffeinated, we embarked on a quest, seeking out the finest boulangerie in Lyon. We emerged from Boulangerie de la Liberté, laden with pastries, baguettes, and other assorted delights, and then made a quick detour to a nearby market to procure some soda and chips, a concession to our American palates, which were beginning to rebel against the relentless onslaught of French cuisine. The train station, a sprawling labyrinth of platforms and confusing signage, presented a formidable challenge. But fear not, dear reader, for we are seasoned travelers, veterans of countless airport terminals and bus depots. We navigated the chaos with the aplomb of a seasoned herd of wildebeest, crossing a busy highway, and eventually found ourselves seated comfortably on a train that was hurtling towards Barcelona at a speed that would make a cheetah weep with envy. The journey was a blur of picturesque landscapes, including a glimpse of the Mediterranean Sea, a majestic castle perched on a hilltop, and a rugby stadium that looked like it could host a gladiatorial combat between 1,000 angry rhinos. We even spotted a flock of flamingos, which I must confess seemed rather out of place in the French countryside. Barcelona welcomed us with a slightly less enthusiastic embrace than Lyon. Perhaps it was the gloomy weather, or maybe it was the fact that our Airbnb was located in a neighborhood that seemed to be perpetually shrouded in a thick fog of suspicion. Whatever the reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into a parallel dimension where everyone was perpetually on edge and local cuisine consisted entirely of deep-fried sardines. We visited L'Atomic, a welcoming haven from the day's hustle of travel. Ursula, Tyler, and I, weary travelers in need of refreshment, settled in for an evening of tapas and drinks. Our journey began with the usual: beer for me, wine for Ursula and Tyler. But Ursula, ever the adventurer, soon found herself captivated by the variety of other libations, while Tyler, a woman of routine, stayed true to her first choice. I, predictably, gravitated towards my trusty margarita. The bartender, a model of hospitality in a foreign land, plied us with a delightful array of complimentary snacks as we navigated the tempting landscape of olives and charcuterie. And to conclude our delightful evening excursion, I indulged in one last sentimental beer. Despite my ongoing reservations, we ventured out to explore the city, starting with a visit to the Picasso Museum. Now, I'm not normally one for art galleries. I find them to be rather stuffy and pretentious. But even I had to admit that Picasso was a bit of a genius. His paintings were like a fever dream, a chaotic explosion of colors and shapes that somehow managed to make sense, or at least more sense than a room full of drunk monkeys with typewriters. We then made our way to the Mediterranean Sea, a vast expanse of water that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The weather, unfortunately, had taken a turn for the worse, and the sky was overcast with a thick blanket of clouds. But even under the gloomy skies, the sea retained its majestic beauty, and we spent a happy hour strolling along the beach, dodging rogue waves and contemplating the meaning of life, or at least the meaning of a particularly good slice of pizza. Our culinary adventures continued with a tapas crawl that took us to a bewildering array of bars and restaurants. We sampled everything from patatas bravas, fried potatoes with a spicy sauce that could melt your face off, to pan con tomate, bread rubbed with garlic and tomato, a dish that I suspect was invented by a particularly lazy chef. We even stumbled upon a beer and wine festival, where we indulged in a variety of local brews and vintages, much to the detriment of our livers, I'm sure. The evening culminated in a rather disastrous attempt to do laundry. Our Airbnb was equipped with a washing machine that seemed to have been designed by a committee of drunken engineers. After much fiddling and cursing, we finally managed to get the machine started, only to be greeted by a cacophony of banging and clanging that suggested the appliance was about to launch itself into orbit. Thanks to Tyler's quick thinking and Ursula's impressive dexterity, she can open a pickle jar with her toes, you know, we managed to avert disaster, but not before the washing machine had given us a thorough scare. Dinner was a somewhat underwhelming affair at a restaurant that may or may not have been a former morgue. The jury's still out on that one. The food was delicious, but the atmosphere was decidedly creepy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by a group of disapproving ghosts. As the day drew to a close, we retreated to our Airbnb, exhausted but satisfied. We had survived another day in the wilds of Europe, and despite the challenges, we had managed to have a rather good time. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. Perhaps a close encounter with a bullfighter, or maybe, just maybe, a paella that didn't taste like disappointment on a plate. Only time would tell. Monday. A day that generally falls upon the unsuspecting populace with all the subtlety of a rogue piano dropped from a great height. But this Monday was different. This particular Monday, we embarked upon our second culinary backstreet food tour, a journey that proved to be as delightfully unpredictable as a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Our first port of call, La Bodega Quimet, transported us to a realm where breakfast consisted of white beans entangled with miniature squid and garbanzo beans cavorting with spinach. Here, bread wasn't merely bread, oh no. It was a canvas for artistic expression, rubbed with garlic and tomato in a ritualistic attempt to appease the gods of staleness, or perhaps just to make it taste nicer. We were joined on this culinary quest by MJ, an Ellicott City native whose day job involved the baffling world of surety bonds, a subject that, I suspect, is best left to those who can explain it without causing their audience to spontaneously combust from sheer boredom. Next, the Gracia Market, an unmitigated cornucopia of gastronomic delights, assaulted our senses with its sheer abundance. Imagine, if you will, a paradise where dried oranges frolic with chocolate and bananas achieve immortality through dehydration. We sampled charcuterie with the enthusiasm of truffle hounds on the scent, devouring egg and pork sausage, fouette, and a veritable United Nations of cheeses. Sheep cheese from the Basque region with the intriguing name Idiasa Bell, Garrocha goat cheese, and a mysterious cow cheese whose name, alas, escaped our grasp. Emerging from the market's intoxicating embrace, we stumbled upon a cafe offering orgzada, a beverage crafted from chufa nuts, cinnamon, and water. These chufa nuts, or tiger nuts, as they are affectionately known, were also presented to us in their dried form, presumably for those who prefer their snacks with a side of existential crunch. Our adventure continued at a nut shop guarded by enigmatic green doors. The shop sign, it seems, had long since abdicated its responsibilities, but fear not, for everyone knew the location of this verdant portal. Tyler, ever the impulsive one, succumbed to the siren call of the chufas and emerged clutching a bag of these enigmatic nuts. At Oilsall, we experienced an olive oil tasting where tradition collided with modernity. 3 distinct olive oils graced our palates, each with a surprisingly peppery finish. Delicious, yes, but also rather unexpected. Like discovering that your grandmother has a secret stash of heavy metal albums. A bonboneria, a haven of chocolatey delights, beckoned us with promises of bacons from heaven, a concept that surely deserves its own theological debate, a cake apparently designed to withstand a siege, perhaps the culinary equivalent of a bomb shelter, and the mysterious Catania. Lunch arrived in the form of a delightful snack of vermouth, anchovies, and Little Russian salad, which I can only assume is potato salad's more diminutive cousin. The addition of seltzer to the vermouth proved to be a stroke of genius, and a mental note was made to recreate this concoction at home. Campognettes, our lunch destination, greeted us with the slightly disconcerting question of whether MJ consumed rabbit. Thankfully, no bunnies were harmed in the making of this lunch, which featured tomato bread, olives, grilled vegetables, and an enigmatic orange sauce that has since vanished from my memory banks. Wine, not sipped or gulped per usual, was poured directly into our mouths, an efficient but novel approach, I must say, and we were treated to a garlic aioli of such purity that it contained only garlic, oil, and salt, like aiolis do. The main course, a symphony of chicken thighs, potatoes, and pork cheek, arrived accompanied by a robust red wine. As we waded through this culinary odyssey, I couldn't help but feel that many of these establishments were subtly, or not so subtly, encouraging us to purchase additional items. A clever tactic, I'll grant you, but one that I saw through with my Sherlock Holmes-like powers of deduction. Or perhaps it was just the lingering effects of the olive oil. Finally, we reached the pinnacle of our gastronomic adventure, churros with a chocolate dipping sauce. A fittingly sweet conclusion to a truly memorable day. Linda, our intrepid guide, deserves a medal for her ability to herd a group of food-obsessed individuals through a 5.5-hour tour, while simultaneously imparting an encyclopedic amount of information. She was, in short, a marvel of organizational skills and good humor. And as the day drew to a close, we found ourselves seeking refuge in the ancestral bar for some post-tour libations before making a final pit stop at Aldi for some mundane household provisions. Because even intrepid culinary explorers need toilet paper, you know. And so, with the dawning of Tuesday, September 24th, we found ourselves embarking on a last-minute quest to conquer the tourist titans of Barcelona. Our mission, should we choose to accept it. And let's face it, we had little choice, having already paid for the tour, was to delve into the city's rich tapestry of history and culture, armed with nothing but our wits, a questionable sense of direction, and a half-eaten bag of patatas bravas. Our guide, a young woman who hailed from the exotic land of Belarus, a place, I'm told, where the national sport involves wrestling bears while reciting poetry, assured us that her tour was the most comprehensive in all of Barcelona. "You will see things," she declared with a flourish, "that will make your eyes pop out of your head and your brain melt like a Dali clock in the midday sun." Our first encounter was with the Sagrada Familia, a basilica so grand, so intricate, so utterly bonkers that it made Gaudi's other architectural creations look like the doodles of a particularly imaginative toddler. Standing before this towering monument to human ingenuity and perhaps a touch of madness, I felt a sense of awe not dissimilar to that experienced by a bowl of petunias contemplating the vastness of the universe. We then plunged into the labyrinthine depths of the Gothic Quarter, a place where ancient history collided with modern-day tourism, in a chaotic symphony of narrow alleyways, overpriced souvenir shops, and selfie-stick-wielding hordes. We dodged our way through the throngs of humanity, marveling at the architectural wonders that somehow managed to survive the onslaught of selfie-obsessed tourists. We even witnessed a human tower, a gravity-defying spectacle that involved a group of intrepid Catalans stacking themselves on top of each other like a particularly ambitious game of Jenga. Lunch was a light affair of tapas, a culinary concept that seems to involve taking perfectly good food and chopping it up into tiny portions. We nibbled on hummus, fried eggplant with honey, a combination that was surprisingly delicious, and fried peppers that were so spicy they could have powered a small rocket. After a brief siesta, a necessity, I assure you, after a morning of dodging tourists and contemplating the meaning of Gaudi's architecture, we ventured out once more, this time in search of dinner and a show. As luck would have it, we stumbled upon a parade, a riot of color and music that seemed to have sprung from the pages of a particularly surreal children's book. Giant puppets danced through the streets, accompanied by a cacophony of drums, trumpets, and whistles. It was a spectacle that could have made even a grumpy cat meme crack a smile. Our culinary quest led us to a hot dog stand called The Dog is Hot, a name that, I must confess, made me want to ask if they were taking suggestions for a new one. The hot dogs, however, were a revelation, juicy and flavorful, and the owner, a friendly Brazilian chap who seemed to be perpetually on the verge of bursting into song, and a fellow Marylander who regaled us with tales of his travels through the UK and other parts of Europe. We then found ourselves swept along by the tide of humanity on Las Ramblas, a bustling boulevard that seemed to be the epicenter of Barcelona's tourist activity. We dodged street performers, souvenir vendors, and pickpockets, or at least we hoped we did, and eventually found ourselves back at the parade, where we marveled at the giant puppets and the infectious enthusiasm of the crowd. As we made our way to the Palau de la Música, a concert hall that looked like it had been designed by a particularly flamboyant gingerbread architect, we witnessed a real-life police chase. 3 plainclothes officers were in hot pursuit of a thief who, it turned out, had just snatched a handbag from an unsuspecting tourist. Justice, it seemed, was swift and efficient in Barcelona. The Palau de la Música, with its ornate facade and opulent interior, was a feast for the senses. The stained glass ceiling, a kaleidoscope of colors and patterns, was so mesmerizing that I almost forgot to breathe. And then the flamenco show began. Now, I'm not normally one for flamenco music. I find it to be a bit too passionate for my taste. but even I had to admit that the performance was electrifying. The dancers, with their swirling skirts and stamping feet, seemed to be channeling the very soul of Spain. The musicians, meanwhile, played with a fiery intensity that could have melted the polar ice caps. It was a spectacle that left us breathless and exhilarated. The following day, we embarked on a Gaudi pilgrimage, starting with a visit to Casa Ballo, a building that looked like it had been designed by a particularly imaginative sea creature. The interior was a riot of curves, colors, and textures, and the rooftop terrace, with its whimsical chimneys and mosaic benches, was like something out of a fairy tale. We then trekked up a rather steep hill to Park Güell, another Gaudi masterpiece that seemed to have been plucked from the pages of a Dr. Seuss book. We wandered through the park's fantastical landscape, marveling at the gingerbread houses, the mosaic salamander, and the serpentine benches that seemed to writhe and twist like playful dragons. After a picnic lunch consisting of sandwiches that we had thoughtfully prepared in our Airbnb's questionable kitchen, we braved the crowds once more to visit the Sagrada Familia. This time we ventured inside, where we were greeted by a breathtaking display of stained glass, soaring columns, and intricate carvings. It was a truly awe-inspiring experience, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound insignificance in the face of such human creativity. Our final Barcelona adventure involved a trip to Montjuïc, a hilltop park that offered stunning views of the city. We rode the funicular railway to the top, where we enjoyed a refreshing drink at the Salt Bar, the very same bar where the diving and swimming competitions were held during the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. We then strolled along the ramparts of Montjuïc Castle, watching the sun set over the city in a blaze of glory. It was a fitting end to our Barcelona escapade. And so the time came to bid farewell to Barcelona, a city that had charmed us with its quirky architecture, its vibrant culture, and its alarmingly persistent lack of wild bananas. We finalized our packing, a task that, as always, seemed to defy the laws of physics and spatial reasoning, and set off for one last brunch at Novella, a charming cafe nestled in the L'Eixample district. The 30-minute walk was a pleasant stroll, a final opportunity to soak in the sights and sounds of this captivating city. The train journey to Madrid was a microcosm of Spanish life, a chaotic blend of noise, laughter, and a complete disregard for personal space. We navigated the queue with the grace of a herd of drunken gazelles, and eventually found ourselves crammed onto a carriage that smelled faintly of oranges and desperation. Someone had actually chained their luggage to the railing, a testament to either their paranoia or the questionable reputation of Spanish train thieves. Madrid greeted us with its usual indifference, a sprawling metropolis of concrete, traffic, and the faint aroma of churros. We checked into our hotel, a blandly efficient establishment that seemed to specialize in providing uncomfortable pillows and lukewarm showers. With time to kill before our flight, we ventured into the nearby mall, a temple of consumerism where we indulged in the unholy trinity of beer, burgers, and boredom. We still had a lot of fun. I just wanted to make another alliteration. It wasn't exactly how we envisioned spending our last night in Spain, but hey, at least the beer was cheap. Next morning, we braved the airport, a place that always seems to bring out the worst in humanity. Ursula, for some inexplicable reason, was once again subjected to an intimate encounter with a security swab, a ritual that seemed to involve a disproportionate amount of eye contact and awkward shuffling. We joined the queue for passport control, a line that snaked its way through the terminal like a particularly sluggish python. And who should we find ourselves standing next to but the same couple from Greensboro, North Carolina, who had shared our original flight to Madrid. It was a small universe, after all. The flight back to the United States was a culinary adventure of sorts. We had pre-ordered Asian vegetarian meals, a choice that turned out to be less exciting than it sounded. The food was edible, if a tad bland, the kind of meal that leaves you feeling vaguely unsatisfied, like you've just eaten a plate of beige. I passed the time by finishing House of Leaves, a book that had been languishing in my bag since the start of the trip. It was a strange and unsettling read, a literary labyrinth filled with shifting perspectives, unreliable narrators, and a healthy dose of existential dread. I found myself both captivated and confused, my attention constantly wandering, much like a hyperactive squirrel in a maze made of words. We landed in Charlotte, already weary from the journey and facing yet another delay. Tyler, bless her adventurous spirit, had continued on without us, while Ursula and I prepared for the final leg of our journey home. Gazing out at the tarmac, a wave of introspection washed over me as I contemplated the whirlwind of experiences we had shared. The tapestry of our journey was woven with vibrant threads of new cities explored, exotic flavors savored, and encounters with individuals so unique they could only have sprung from the depths of the most surreal dreams. Laughter and tears had been our companions, and the peculiar banana ceviche would forever hold a place in our culinary hall of fame. Although the infamous wild banana remained a figment of our imaginations, the kaleidoscope of memories we had created would be etched in our hearts, a testament to the enduring magic of friendship, the thrill of adventure, and the beauty of embracing life's inherent absurdity.